I'm live. It is a Thursday afternoon. No, it's Friday. Sorry. I don't know what's going on with the days. It's Friday afternoon, the 7th of January 2022, and I am reading aloud out of a book I started writing in 2006. I finished book 1 in 2017, entitled is the BLISS Afterlife. And I am now well into this story. I think I wrote this sometime in 16. But we are back at chapter 90, New Year's Eve. Here we are, Faye and Ben and friends on New Year's Eve, and it is 2011, the 31st of December. Faye and Anna had prepared a variety of food. Everyone loved the borscht, the soup Anna made, and the delicious dim sum Faye had made. They, Faye and Ben, Anna, Peter, the old friend of him who had let his flat to Tony whilst he was away at university. Dilly had come and brought a couple of friends who were in their 20s. They had such a good time getting to know each other. The nationalities present were rather varied. Faye came from China, Anna from Russia, Ben was a mix of English and Indian, Dilly had Jamaican heritage and so had her two friends. Peter was English, and there was much laughter about meanings of words and jokes, which were always funnier in an accent. Peter could put the Scottish accent on so well that they were just falling about. Anna had just come back into the conservatory when she bumped into Peter. She had noticed him looking at her, and she thought he was very good looking and so funny. "So, how do you know Faye and Ben?" He had noticed her. She was rather quiet, but her laughter was really infectious. She and Faye seemed great friends, and he was so glad he had decided to come. He had been to see his mother in London and was going back to Scotland to university in a couple of days. He had to concentrate on his studies, much less than a year, and he would be a fully qualified architect. He was determined nothing would distract him, but Anna had made quite an impression on him. "Oh, I've known them not long." She couldn't help blushing. That whole story, she wished she could just forget about it, but it had happened, and she really felt she couldn't give a flippant answer to him. "Actually, I have been in the refuge for a few weeks. I had made a big mistake. I came here with somebody leading me away as an estray, and thankfully I realized in time to run away." She had to laugh. His face was so flabbergasted, and she did not want to make the evening serious all of a sudden. She felt she'd been saved by the bell, they say, and she did not feel scarred. Not since she had been so welcomed at Susan's and had this really lovely connection with Faye. She had been useful in the house, and she was looking forward to her parents. "Hey, I was resident here for quite some time in that refuge, when I was a teenager. My mum had run away to that place too." He laughed. She's never been better since she left here. Gosh, years ago. No numbers anyway. He laughed as Susan had rang Peter earlier and had told him about the no-number game of the oldies, as they call them, out of earshot. For years they had. "Actually, now you mention this, I heard Holly and Chris talk about you at Christmas. Your mum started her own business. Didn't she marry again?" "Yes, she did, and I had a lovely time with them. In fact, I came from my mum's place just outside London, and we'll go back to Scotland on the 2nd. I shall stay in the refuge for a couple of nights. As long as I make the bed, Susan said. They laughed. There were now plans afoot, with Ben and Faye staying longer, and Anna's parents arriving, and also Faye's parents, although no one knew when they would come, as they wanted to be here closer to the birth of their first grandchild. Susan was ready to plan the rooms once the new year started properly next week. "Do you fancy going into the garden? It's such a beautiful night. Almost full moon." Peter looked at Anna. "Yes, why not? It's quite warm in here. I love the wood fire, but I could do with a little fresh air." Both walked out into the garden. Dilly was so glad she had decided to come to the little party. Anna had mentioned it to her, and little Winston was still with his grandparents. They had moved from the north of England back to London only last year, and it had been great to have them around looking after Winston occasionally. She had not had much contact with them for a few years, when they were living in Leeds, but her father had retired and they had come back to London, where they had both started their lives when they were coming over from Jamaica. She knew her mum never approved of single mothers, and it took little Winston to change her attitude. She had taken the train to see them when he was 5, and they could not resist him. In the last few years they had more often had contact, and now they had moved back. Dilly felt so free. The 2 young friends were daughters of one of her mum's friends in Leeds, visiting for a few days, and they were so funny. Their accents were pure Leeds, and for Anna all this was so interesting that the evening just flew by. On toasting the new year it became quite emotional. An extra person will be around soon, and they all sang Auld Lang Syne in a fashion, and all went into the garden to let off a few fireworks to mark the new year. Chapter 91. Savannah's New Year. Savannah was exhausted. She had had a wonderful New Year's Eve. She had been sad that both Steve and her had prior engagement for this evening, but she had enjoyed her time very much. She'd been asked to drum and celebrate with a local group of women, and they had all brought things to eat. She was paid to come, but not a fortune, and the evening was a celebration for everyone. The new year of 2012 had begun, and Savannah sat down with a glass of wine in her studio to consider her dreams for the year ahead. There had been much talk tonight of the changing times. She had been fascinated by mythology and fairy tales from childhood. She was often called a dreamer when young, but had pretty much pursued a career and not taken herself very seriously with her beliefs in the ethereal. She loved astrology, but never studied it properly. In the last few years, having left her old job working with a large hotel chain 5 years ago, ancient history, the realms of the shaman and matters of a more metaphysical nature occupied much of her thinking. God, I don't know where this cut out. I start chapter 91, Savannah on New Year's Eve. Savannah was exhausted. She'd had a wonderful New Year's Eve. She had been sad that both Steve and her had prior engagements for this evening, but she had enjoyed it very much. She had been asked to drum and celebrate in a local group with women, and they had all brought things to eat. She was paid to come, not a fortune, but the evening was a celebration for everybody. The new year of 2012 had begun, and Savannah sat down with a glass of wine in her study to consider her dreams for the year ahead. There had been much talk tonight of the changing times. She had been fascinated by mythology and fairy tales from childhood. She was often called a dreamer when young, but had pretty much pursued a career and not taken herself very seriously with her beliefs in the ethereal. She loved astrology, but had never studied it. In the last years, Having left her old job with a large hotel chain 5 years ago, seems like ancient history now, the realms of the shaman and matters of the more metaphysical nature occupied much of her thinking and her work. Poppy was so independent, and although they saw each other fairly regularly, Savannah had built herself a new life since she moved into this house, working from home in the studio, which had been such a great change for her. Looking back, the last few years have been quite focused on working in the area she loved, almost like an adventure, at least in hindsight. The journey to here had been quite arduous sometimes, but she was glad her life started to shape in the way she had hoped. Meeting Steve was a bit of a surprise. Looking back, the last few years have been quite focused on working in the area she loved, almost like an adventure, at least in hindsight. The journey to here had been quite arduous sometimes, but she was glad her life started to shape in the way she had hoped. Meeting Steve was a bit of a surprise. They had a lot of fun together, although she sometimes wondered if he really understood her. The last few months had passed so quickly. She had a brief chat with him about midnight. He was playing at a local venue and was due to come to her place once all was packed up. In fact, she had just heard the bell. She had a brief chat with him around midnight, but he was playing in a local venue and was to come to her place once he was all packed up. In fact, she had just heard the little bell which chimed when somebody came into the garden. The garden gate had been opened. She jumped up to welcome him. Happy New Year of 2012. He took her into his arms. Happy New Year, Steve. So lovely to see you, and tell me about your evening. Steve got himself a glass and they settled to chat. It was New Year's Day. That's it for today, I think.